I'm Kate Griffin. I work with the Aspen Institute's Financial Security Program, and for the last 9 months or so, I have been leading a national task force to prevent fraud and scams, which we're going to talk a little bit about what that means today. On any given day in this country, 51,000 people lose money to a scam. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, and it has a population of 17,000 people, so that's actually 3 times the population of my small hometown. Every single day loses as much as $400 million. Every single day. In its most recent reporting, we saw that just one of the U.S. federal law enforcement agencies that help to prosecute these criminals, the U.S. Secret Service last year recovered $400 million for victims of these scams. 1 day's worth of losses. If you believe that you are getting more and more texts, more and more outreach from someone that you think is your bank and it's not, more and more emails to your work email, we are under a growing threat. And this threat is affecting everyone. It is no longer a problem that we think about as only something affecting older Americans, although it does. In fact, it affects, on a frequency basis, younger people just as much as older people. There's a barbell-shaped curve. It's just that older people are losing more money than younger people because they have more money to steal. And are a target because of that. And it is a threat that is coming from many different, in many different forms. So of course, we are all getting a lot of text messages these days. They are telling us about tolls or potential fines that we might have. They're giving us job offers, or they're just saying hi. But it's also coming in the form of phone calls. Phone calls that you might get on a busy day when you're rushing to get to the next meeting or a doctor's appointment, and on the other end of the line you hear, "Hi, this is the FBI calling. We believe your accounts have been compromised and we need you to help us with this investigation." That's how a woman in Rockville, Maryland lost $500,000. It is fake businesses online. It is buying that puppy that your daughter is begging you for, but turns out there is no puppy. It is looking for companionship online and finding out later that the person that you have been talking to is not that person at all. And so why would we be talking about this at a financial health conference? And it has everything to do, of course, with the amounts of money people are losing. Sometimes it is $100 or $200 or $500, amounts that we all know are significant to people. And sometimes it is your entire life savings and your inability now to have a secure retirement. But it is also a loss of trust in our financial systems, in our systems of commerce, in a digital world. How do we be able to trust the interactions that we have online when there are this many imposters and scams and criminals threatening us? And finally, it is also an incredibly costly thing to combat. One of the many reasons that I personally got into this work was an experience that I bet many of you have had as well. Let me phrase it as a question. How many times have you worked for months on a really important innovation that was going to have incredible impact on the financial health of your customers, only to meet a speed bump or a detour sign or a flat-out roadblock or barrier from someone on the fraud team or the risk team or the compliance team? Yeah? Sound familiar? Right? They're doing incredible work. They're incredible fraud fighters in all of our organizations, and we want them to be successful at their jobs, but sometimes them being successful at their jobs actually makes it harder for us to do our jobs to build financial health for everyone. And that is a conundrum that we have to lean into and start to solve more of. We have to have the financial health conversation at the same time. And lastly, I think it's also really important in this conversation to understand what is the threat or the attack that we are under. For any of you that know me, I mean, I've been coming to Emerge conferences for probably 12 or 15 years. And you're like, these are words I've never heard coming out of Kate's mouth before. I tell you this because the things I've had to learn and the places that I've had to sit and have conversations with people are astonishing. The people behind this are transnational organized crime rings, many of them in Southeast Asia, although it's a growing crime building out in other regions of the world. We're having this conversation in national security circles, in law enforcement circles. I'm now a guest at all sorts of fraud conferences that Matt goes to all the time. This conversation is growing, and there is a growing interest in solving for this problem. And so at the Aspen Financial Security Program, the reason that the way that we decided to start to tackle and look at this problem was to recognize that this is not just a problem that our friends in the financial services industry had to solve for. That's just where the victims end last, right? You will see a victim when they have already been scammed and they are moving their money. But there is a whole ecosystem of actors that are critical to work with when thinking about how to actually prevent these scams from happening anymore. And so our National Task Force on Fraud and Scam Prevention looks at the entire scam life cycle, from online platforms such as Google and Meta, and the dating sites, onto the telecommunications and wireless industry. So why are we getting those text messages? The retail industry, Target and Amazon, the breadth of actors within financial services, data companies who have better data to help us fix this problem, our law enforcement agents and our federal financial regulators are all sitting around a table with us at Aspen working on how do we actually create better, more coordinated solutions and get more resources to fight this. So we wanted to have a conversation today with a couple of the actors who are around the table with us, really each representing an important part of that system. So it's a chance for all of you to hear a little bit more about what is both the landscape of fraud and scams and also where are there glimmers of hope in terms of ways that we can start to combat this. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to do just a quick intro. Better for you to do it than me because you know yourselves better. But I'm actually going to start with you, Jolene. Tell us what you do and how do you fight scams?
Yeah, so my name is Jolene Gunther. I have over 2 decades of experience in preventing fraud from different government, nonprofit organizations. I now work with ARP, the largest nonprofit in the nation. And what I do is I run their B2B programs. How can we work with the financial industry to spot and stop fraud before it happens? And we've been able to work with over 1,500 organizations, financial organizations, and with our partnerships, we've been able to save consumers over $400 million to date.
That's amazing. All right. Matt, you play a different role that's equally important.
Yeah, I do. Great to see everyone. So I am the chief of staff for Sardine. We are a fraud prevention company. We protect maybe 500 businesses, from banks to financial institutions, issuers, e-commerce platforms, mom and pop merchants. We touch basically every industry. We also work with the intelligence communities, so US governments, et cetera, some European NATO governments as well. Been a fraud fighter for the last 16 years, mostly as a customer, not on the vendor side, and started off in military intelligence doing cyber fraud for the NSA. So a little bit different areas.
Yeah, thank you. Darius,
Great.
also an important part of the ecosystem.
Thank you so much. So I'm Darius Kingsley, My title, as you can see, is a little bit mysterious: consumer banking practices. A lot of these large banks, some of us have strange titles, and you're like, what the heck does that person do? But I will boil it down to you for 3 pretty simple words: scams, seniors, and sustainability. I'm sort of the fraud and scam owner for our Chase consumer banking and branch network. I'm the elder customer segment owner for the whole firm, for all of JPM, including private bank. I'm also the consumer owner of all of our sustainability strategy. So a lot of super interesting topics here today.
Yeah, thank you. Great. I want to start with you, Jolene, because you and your team spend a lot of time talking directly with the victims. You have incredible services that you provide, and then you're also translating that into what does it mean for the people who are the front line of this to actually prevent and disrupt. Talk to us a little bit about both how people are perceiving scams, or maybe what the myths are that you're combating, and what you see as sort of the best-in-class sort of prevention techniques for frontline staff.
Yeah, such great questions. I think one of the misconceptions is really who this happens to. Right? We hear about it in the news, and sometimes there's a judgment to it, and that's psychologically, like if you see a crime happen, you're like, well, that wouldn't happen to me. I'm not walking home late at night. Or that wouldn't happen to me because I'm well educated or graduated from college. And the fact is that it can happen to anyone. It doesn't matter your wealth status, your education status. And let me talk to you a little bit about the vulnerabilities to being a target of a scam. And I'll do this in this way. How many of you know someone in your circle that has one of these vulnerabilities, and you can raise your hand, someone who is socially isolated, who recently had a divorce or loss of a spouse, somebody who has cognitive decline, and then someone who may have a health issue that puts them into, they're going to see the doctor a lot, or they're hospitalized. And if you guys have seen, now everybody raise your hand who raised your hand at least once. Now look around. Almost everybody is raising their hand. We know someone who's vulnerable to someone, to a fraud scheme. And so one of the things that we work on specifically is really the B2B play. Is how can we actually stop it in conjunction with our relationships with financial institutions? And I think one of the ways that regulators look at it is, there are different regulations. Some of them work, some of them are a challenge. And one of the things that we did specifically is we did a study. So we worked with over 200 financial institutions, Virginia Tech University, basically did the study, and we worked with over 2,000 frontline employees, and we had them fill out a form every time they saw a suspicious transaction. Anybody who was consumer facing. And then we analyzed basically what were the interventions that were effective in stopping that money from ever leaving the account. And do you know what they were? 3 of the largest by far. Delaying the transaction, which can be as easy as just asking additional questions. And Darius and I were talking about this earlier, that the front lines, we don't give them enough credit. They can really step up to intervene and say something, because 1 out of 2 times when they do, they're able to stop that suspicious transaction. So delaying that transaction. The next is holding that transaction so an investigation can occur. And then the last is refusing a transaction. So one of the things that we did at AARP is we took those learnings and we put together with the industry and created an online training that is also compliant with the Senior Safe Act, that really teaches people how to not only spot it and report it, but really what are the action steps that they can do and take. And that's what I mentioned earlier about saving those over $400 million with our friends at Chase, as well as the other 1,500 organizations that we work with. But that's not all. One of the things that we want to do too is looking at promising practices. What works? What works in Japan? What works in the United Kingdom? What are promising practices that's happening maybe at a small 1-branch financial institution that might be applicable or useful for a larger organization? And so what we do is we put together those promising practices from their peers and really disseminate that. One of the things we're coming out with in a couple of weeks on World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, which is June 15th, are some promising practice videos from the UK, from bankers who are talking about what they're doing to stop this. And by doing that, we're able to share those, and we're seeing that those are adopted as well. So those are some of the things that we're working on to really stop this.
That's incredible. One of the things I think that's really interesting or critical to understand about this scam fighting piece is that you're at a place where someone's already interacted with a criminal, and now we sort of think that that's happening, and we want to help stop that interaction. Matt, the work that you and Sardine is doing is really trying to then help financial institutions and these other actors be able to say, how does the data infrastructure that we have help us to know even earlier that a criminal might be among us, and try to help institutions to take action? So describe a little bit more about how you all do that.
There's no way that you're too smart to fall for a scam, right? And that's actually not true. We see this actually time and time again. So our technology is pretty synergistic, and so we take a very holistic approach to fighting any type of scams and fraud across all of the industries. We're really heavily focused on behaviors. So, there's a lot of different really cool high-speed technologies. In fact, JPMorgan is probably, I would put them best in class on the fraud. That's why I bank with them, because best in class on the fraud prevention side for most banks. But most companies that don't have billions of dollars to invest in counter fraud tech, you really want to take a behavior approach. There's something called behavioral biometrics. And the reason for that is bad actors and good actors will follow similar trends, and those behaviors are very easy to identify, actually. So traditional technologies, even IP geolocation type technologies, rule-based systems, even some of the machine learning models, with modern technologies, the bar of entry is extremely low, and it's very, very, very easy to get through them, is what we're seeing. And so especially with some of the AI automation, we're seeing a lot of AI-type automation attacks. So I'll give you an example of a very large issuer, just happened last week. In 18 seconds, they lost $170 million to an AI automation attack. 18 seconds. So that's what we're seeing. And by the way, we believe that the attacker was a 19-year-old kid that has no computer experience at all. So that's the problem, is the bar of entry has become so low because of modern technologies that there's even, I won't give out the name, but there's even an AI system that will allow you to build zero-day type attacks, right? So you can go in and say, hey, I want a script that will credential stuff JPMorganChase and tell me when I put in the correct username and password. Luckily, they have systems to defend against that type of attack. However, there's a lot of companies that do not. So it's very, very simple now in that bar of entry. So we are using, unfortunately, you have to use AI to fight AI. What we're seeing is traditional machine learning. A lot of the systems that are very commonly used in our ecosystem are no longer sufficient to combat more of the automation type attacks that we're seeing, especially deepfakes. The deepfakes are very, very good nowadays, and they're getting more and more better. Probably month over month, we're seeing improvements. They're able to get through liveness scans. So even like human detection liveness scans are able to get through. We have a system that can spin up new IDs that will pass any IDV system in 7 seconds. So that technology is an incredible threat. We believe the future is actually collaboration. So that's how you beat it, is actually having banks and e-commerce merchants and all of the different ecosystems, from the issuers to the fintechs, actually working together in more of a consortium type model. And because we believe that, especially in fraud and security, it's very isolated. Right? People don't talk about it very often. They treat it like it's an NSA shop, right? That they can't discuss fraud and best practices. However, what we're seeing is the attackers on one institution are going to the other institution. And so sharing those best practices and creating that kind of synergistic model across the industry is becoming incredibly powerful.
Yeah, I'll just say, Matt, when we did an initial sort of scan of all of these different ecosystem actors of what would be sort of the most pressing problem we need to solve for today that will ultimately prevent or deter these criminals, and sort of an ability to share information across that ecosystem was like everyone's number one answer. Yeah. All right, so Darius, here we have tools that help you think about your frontline teams and your customers, tools that help the back office sort of think about the infrastructure they need to prevent the deterrence. You got an incredible shout out for being very good at this.
Awesome. Thank you, by the way.
What,
True.
so tell us then, sort of how does JPMorganChase think about this as a holistic strategy, and how are you thinking about continuing to evolve that as we move forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. By the way, great comments. So I think the learning thank you again for the compliment. I think the learning for us though has been, and by the way, this is a journey. It's a never-ending journey, but even for us internally, and I appreciate you calling us best in class, but there's still, keeping up with the threats is nonstop and relentless. For us, it was realizing that we really had to think about it, how scams and fraud manifest themselves for our customers throughout the organization. And so, like, I'll just tell you, like, personally, how I kind of started this journey was about probably 5 years ago. I think just before COVID, I got a couple of complaints. Not, again, I think Jillian, you mentioned this, not from elder customers, but from their like adult children, and who sent very long, angry emails to a couple, or letters to a couple of super senior people at Chase, at JPMorgan, and they passed it on down to me. And these are like heartbreaking stories, and when you look at them, you start to like unpack all the things that happen, right? Customer, with a couple $1 million worth of savings, and over 6 months wound up giving it all away. And not just in one transaction, there were some online transfers, there, some digital activity, they were showing up in several different branches, multiple branches, multiple wires, just this whole sort of like pattern. And like, how could you miss that? Like how did this system not work? And so what I started to do was really like think about it like from the very start, from the moment we interact with the customer, and I'll talk about customer education or how we think about that in a second, but even just internally, like where does it come in? Are we training our bankers properly? Well, of course, every financial institution has training, but could we do better? And so that's where we partnered with AARP, for example, and every Chase banker has to take AARP's Bank Safe training, and you've also been gracious enough to we have input every year into like what the latest scams are too, so we keep it kind of up to date. But that's just like one piece of the puzzle, right? What happens when it comes into a call center? Risk rules. As I started to sort of tackle how are our risk rules? You can't put age into risk rules. Age is a protected class. Well, hold on a minute. And so like there's a whole battle with like the legal department and the risk department and like where can we bring in age? Even went to the CFPB to talk to them about it and get their blessing or disblessing, as the case may be. But it was like, that aspect. What happens is it sort of passes through the system internally. What happens when it gets to like our global security department? Because that global security department was then often they were the people making the really like difficult outbound calls to customers and really hand-holding them, as well as making referrals to law enforcement. And so just internally, like really unpacking how we handle a fraud and scam internally. I think every organization has to do that, kind of almost actually regardless of whatever business you're in, as like if you're customer facing. And then even in the way that we educate our customers, how do we talk about it with people, right? And like, I could probably ask how many people here think they're likely to fall for a scam, and I can imagine most of you would say, not me personally, someone else, right? This is what you said. And like most of our customers are that way too. Like none of them believe, so like you tell them, you warn them about fraud and scams, and quite frankly, most of them aren't gonna listen. They're just not. So how do you connect with them? And so like really rethinking that, and like a couple of insights we had, like they do generally trust our people. It turns out they also trust the Chase brand. And so like literally coming up with a scam flyer, a hard printed piece of paper that says these are common scams with the Chase logo on the bottom. Turns out that actually printing out this old-fashioned piece of paper and handing it out to customers when you're trying to have that conversation really like they may not believe the banker. They might, if I'm the banker, you're not gonna, you're like, yeah, you're just some random like guy trying to talk me out of my transaction. But oh, here it is on a piece of paper. Oh yeah, there's my scam. Like it can break the spell. How do you get out into low and moderate income communities, right? They're just, And so like we have a community development team. I'm sure many of you have probably met some of them. We have community managers out in the field. Having them host, actual like, and I'm sorry, I'm spacing on the word right now, meetings. Thank you. Yeah, exactly, workshops on scam and fraud prevention, right? Because I think part of the realization for all of us has been like, it's a key component, which is why we're here, key component of financial health. So you can't have a financial health discussion without making sure that you warn people, that you talk to them, that you explain how to keep your money safe. And so just, really thinking about all the ways we communicate with customers, who are our customers who are non-digital, who never go online, who don't use the app? Well, they're not seeing the emails maybe that we send them, so we send them a letter in the mail, a hard printed letter in plain English with, really simple descriptions of these scams, just doing all the things we can to try to like interrupt it. And so I think where are we headed, like a couple of, if I ask the end of your question, a couple of big kind of picture things jump to mind, one of which is AI. So you covered that. I really don't think people understand the degree to which we as a society are like unprepared for AI agents and for a lot of just how good the letters look, right? And so when and we're seeing this already, like the number of bank impersonation scams of customers thinking they're hearing from Chase. You're getting a text saying there's fraud on your account. Did you make this? Well, no, I didn't. Oh my God, no, I didn't panic. And then you call the number that's in your text. You're panicking. You're not thinking, oh yeah, let me go to the back of my card. You're talking to the scammer. I mean, it is just unbelievably good, right? The letters, the emails you're getting, they're perfect. You're not Nigerian scam emails anymore with all sorts of misspellings and Britishisms. So like that's definitely one thing that I like is really keeping me up at night, and I don't know how, like, other than working with folks like you, to really continue to combat that. And the other thing I think we have to kind of look forward to, and I think both of you touched on, particularly Jolene, is in American society, I feel like when it comes to banks, when it comes to money, we all have this ingrained attitude that it's my money and I can take it out whenever I want to. I can make a payment whenever I want to. I can pay for something. I should be able to Zelle someone and it can get there right away. And I think like one of the big learnings for us all, and this is going to continue to work on, is you're going to see more and more friction. It's inevitable. I wish it wasn't the case, because nothing infuriates our customers more than being told, we're not sending that wire, we're not letting you. Try telling an older customer, no, I'm not going to give you $5,000 in cash because I know you're going to feed it into the Bitcoin machine, right? They are livid. They are absolutely livid. And I think like we as a society, we haven't internalized yet this idea that maybe there's just going to be more friction. And sometimes, unfortunately, we're going to get it wrong. And, but sometimes we're going to get it right. And so I think like walking that through a little bit, or a lot over the next several years, so you're just going to see more and more of that.
Well, and I think it's important too, how we think about the storytelling that we need to be doing. I think the more that this is not a story about like, oh, poor grandma, she's so silly, right? That kind of story, we have to banish that from the way we tell the story and really talk about the threat that we are under and that there are criminals trying to steal our money, so that we become a little bit more accepting of the kind of friction that will need to be put into place. One of the pieces that we're grappling with, so the work of the task force, immediate next step is to build out what a coordinated national strategy would look like. How do all of these players come together and work on ways to truly prevent this crime from happening and deter the criminal impact as much as possible? We think about what is the enabling environment we need for that. What are the kinds of infrastructure or other elements we need to have into play in addition to everything that's been talked about here? I'm curious what each of you would say should be on that wish list of sort of what needs to be further built out in this enabling environment to prevent this kind of criminal actor from being successful.
Go first. Sorry, well, we'll do
Go
reverse
for it.
order. Okay.
Go for it.
So and you were touching on it through a lot of your Aspen work. And so I think, what happens is when a person shows up in a financial institution, they're probably already under the spell. And whether they just simply believe it's like, oh, it's a legitimate transaction, I'm actually trying to buy this thing, or whether they're truly down like the rabbit hole of the scam. And I think how do we intervene sooner? How do we get to them before that, right? How do we break that? And you mentioned it earlier, which is that Kate, which was how many of you have gotten a text today from an Easy Pass toll violation or whatever it is? We're being sort of assaulted, I feel like, by fakery, by the scammers much earlier on in the cycle, just all the time. And I think the work you're doing is super important. Is on my wish list is really bringing together. It's not just banks trying to keep their customers safe. It's all of us should be trying to work together to keep the scammers out of the system and out of your texts and out of your emails and phone calls and just across the complete spectrum.
I think that's such a great point. One of the things that we see, especially when you're talking to a consumer, they're under that spell, and usually when they're having that point of contact is when that transaction is being made. So how do you get them out of the spell? Well, psychology tells us we have to tell someone 3 times before it kind of sinks in. Does anybody have teenagers here? You tell them to take out the trash, how many times you telling them? Yes, we're laughing because it's a couple of times. It's the same way with fraud. They need to hear it from their banker. They need that piece of paper. They need to hear it from a nonprofit like ARP. They need to hear about it from law enforcement. But I feel like there is a microscope on the transaction part of the problem, and we really need to look at the ecosystem, right? How are these criminals contacting these people? What mediums are they using? And Kate mentioned this before. It's they're using the phone, the internet, social media, dating websites. It's getting at those points, bringing those players in at the beginning so that we can help prevent this from happening and get these criminals off of these platforms that are encouraging these criminal acts. One of the things is we're releasing these videos from the UK about promising practices, and in my interviews with one of the bank at TSB Bank, and what they do is they voluntarily reimburse their victims up to £1 million per instance. And what he said was, our reimbursement on spoofing, the majority of it is one telecom company that even though we're telling them, hey, there are these numbers you need to block from criminals, they're not doing it and we're reimbursing it. So we really need to think about how we can bring in these other players earlier to really combat this so that we're not seeing at the end where we're having to break that spell. And so that's what I would kind of say in terms of the ecosystem of where we need to kind of focus. And that's why it's so important, the work that you're doing, Kate, and the work that we're doing together. I know ARP and Chase are both sponsors of this work, and really proud to be part of that effort.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah,
I'm
I
curious
actually have a
what-
completely different opinion, so that'll be interesting. I actually have given up all hope on teaching people to defend themselves from fraud, and here's why. We will send a text message to someone in big, bold letters that says, we're not going to ask for this, do not give it out. And the first thing they do is give it out. So like what we have seen is time and time again, no matter how much you get in front of someone in a state of panic, they make bad decisions. So I think that it's more of a responsibility for the banks, the issuers, the e-commerce merchants, all the way up through the chain to defend the customers. And I think that definitely awareness of what's happening in scams and fraud is critical, like what you're talking about, giving out the information. But what I have seen is even with awareness, they still fall for it. And it's a huge problem. And so the key is how do you protect someone against themselves, right? And so, the other thing that we see is this liability shift that's happening across the globe. And so, like in the UK, it's a little bit different, but in the US, I can tell you there's banks and even fintechs that we work with where if you participate in the fraud event or you participate in the scam, you're taking liability for it, not the bank or the fintech. So it depends on what it is, but for example, if they don't follow Reg E, right, in particular, it's business banking in particular, do not expect provisional credits in a lot of cases, do not expect to get your money back. And what's gonna happen is they're gonna say, we met all industry standard security controls, right? So we did everything on our part to protect you. We notified you, we blocked the transaction, we told you this is fraud. You still argued with us, took the money out and put it into a Bitcoin machine, it's on you. And so I think that there is also a trend now, and I think it's gonna happen more and more, and I'm 100% aligned to what you said on this. I think actually friction is a good thing, not a bad thing. And what we're seeing in a lot of research that we're doing is increased friction, especially at the, call it the merchant level or even at the issuer level primarily, I can't speak on behalf of the banks, actually increases trust in the institutions and platforms and increases spend. So we did a very large-scale research on this at both an issuer and e-commerce merchants, and by stepping up high-dollar transactions actually led to an increase in spend and not an increase in churn, which is the big common trend. So I think that there's going to be more and more of that in the future, of this like tactical friction approach to be able to mitigate these losses, because again, like you just can't. I know fraud fighters that fall for fraud all the time. So it doesn't matter how good you are, how educated you are with the new modern attack vectors and AI, the voice emulations, you could be talking to a 15-year-old kid in Nigeria, and I guarantee he's going to sound like a PhD from Harvard. So it does not matter these days. So unfortunately, that's the route we're going.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that very much, and I find it very interesting to be in a space where for years we really talked a lot about speeding up payments. And I actually think there's a lot to be said here around the kind of friction we're talking about being distinct from a speed of payments issue, right? That payments that go faster and really help people in terms of their financial lives, being able to manage that cash flow is a little bit different than the kind of friction that we're talking about here, which is to slow down and ask a couple of questions and make sure that something is, that you can break that spell if you need to. I'm curious too, just the other kind of component of the ecosystem, of course, these are crimes. And I'm curious what you all are seeing in terms of law enforcement's ability to go after these criminals and what further help you think that they might need.
I'll start on this time if you don't mind. Only because this is very top of mind. We work very closely with the U.S. government also, and especially the intelligence communities. Basically, does anyone know what an extraditionary treaty is? Anyone know what that is? It means does the government have the legal ability to extradite a criminal to come back and face charges in the United States? Most of these crimes happen in countries without extraditionary treaties. The local countries are not going to prosecute on the United States' behalf. I give you my word. It's very, very, now that's different for NATO, Five Eyes, et cetera. That's completely different. They absolutely will, but that's because there's a lot of partnership and extraditionary treaties that go into play. But for example, if it happens in Nigeria and different Southeast Asian countries, let's say China, for example, I assure you that if Bank of America calls the Chinese government and says, hey, we have a scammer that is, stealing money from our customers, they're gonna, send a balloon over to Bank of America. Like they just don't care. And so that's a huge problem that we see is that because of this lack of extraditionary agreements and this like partnership government to government, and also the other thing that we see is when you cut the head off the snake and you go after the big one, someone else just steps in. So I don't think, I actually, and I tend to be more pessimistic these days. I don't think we'll ever stop fraud and scams for a very, very long time. I think it's going to exponentially grow into the future. I think that what we could do is be better about technology and defending against them and using the same techniques, right? Fraudsters are usually ahead of the fraud fighters. So we have to just be more proactive and engage. Like I'm a big proponent of like using age to increase the amount of security to protect them, right? But those are things that we're not allowed to do, right? So if you're a senior citizen, right, like you should have more controls on your account to make sure that you're protected. And because you lose your retirement, you got serious problems, right? And so it seems okay for me to send an email and say, hey, just want to make sure that you agree to send out $10,000 to this person that you've never done it before.
One of our task force members said something to me that always sticks in my mind, that this work is zombies, not dragons. which I needed that explained to me because I'm not a sci-fi person. Dragons you slay and they're dead. And zombies are very hard to kill, but you have to manage them and corral them off and be kind of forever putting up defenses. And I think what you're saying, Matt, here is really emblematic of that. So zombies, not dragons. Other things that come to mind around the law enforcement question?
Yeah, by the way, you're absolutely right about another thing that's changed, I think, over the past 5 years is what you're highlighting, which is that these scams really genuinely are originating overseas, and they're originating, and I had I was in California, and someone from the Secret Service presented in front of the California Senate, and showing satellite pictures. So in like Myanmar, in Thailand, they'll human traffic people. So they will lure people from China and India on promises of false job and literally entrap them into very large buildings with not let them out. They have to work, 18 hours a day. And they're stuck there. Their passports are taken away. They can't get out. So New York Times has written about this. And the satellite pictures are kind of amazing because there's satellite pictures showing literally rice paddies. And this is kind of up against like the border with China, like the northern parts of these countries, Laos, which were literally rice paddies 5 years ago. And now you would think is like a bunch of Amazon warehouses, outside of St. Louis. I mean, they're just like massive, but they're surrounded by barbed wire. And we know this because some people have come out. This is the scale, and this money is leaving the country. It's not staying in the country. And so I think law enforcement definitely wants to help, and I think partly to answer your, what's on my wish list as well, is one of the things that law enforcement has, highlighted for us is it's slow to get information out of the banking system. And a lot of that is, frankly, the rules, Bank Secrecy Act and customer confidentiality, and so if we have a fraudster, a scammer who takes over a Chase account and defrauds a U.S. bank customer, and then the fraudster moves the money over to us real fast and then moves it to another bank that then goes overseas, and U.S. Bank kind of calls us up, we're kind of who is this on behalf of? What do you know? There's only so much information you can share, and all of this is kind of slow, and by that time, money is long gone. And so law enforcement, I feel like we're getting a lot of traction, but there's things on my wish list I want, better information sharing, which is a really, really, really big one. And I know Aspen's taking kind of a lead in thinking about what that is. And then think about it as well, law enforcement, I feel like FBI and others have kind of mentioned, when was the last time you saw a big national headline around some scam chief going to jail, being convicted and going to jail? You see it for cartel drug lords. You see it for, child pornographers. You don't see it for scammers. And so how do we start letting it known that we're coming after you?
Yeah, and I just wanted to add a little to that. I think these criminals are very sophisticated, as we've kind of talked about. These are criminal networks. They like the fact that we're in silos, that we can't pass information from financial institution to financial institution or through to law enforcement. But I think, in kind of summarizing, there is hope, right? When you educate someone in the right way using behavioral mechanisms, we found in studies that 44% of people who take that are able to stop a scam from happening to them. We know also with the friction case, we've done a survey with people over the age of 50 that have a bank account. When their bank reaches out to stop that scam or get involved, trust increase, as you've mentioned too, significantly, over 50%. And so there is hope that we can do something. 1 out of 2 times a banker says something to someone, it actually stops it. But people do need to hear it more than once, just like your teenager son.
Thank you. So I think I just want to summarize quickly because, and I thank you for ending on a note of hope, because it can be sometimes a very hard conversation to digest. It is a complex problem. And the good news is that there is a role for every single one of us in this room and among your colleagues to play, whether that is a consumer-facing role, a data and infrastructure role, a liaison with law enforcement role. And so I urge any of you that are interested in thinking about this more, connecting us with your teams, to please do so. You can learn more about the task force at fraudtaskforce.aspeninstitute.org. And our friends at JPMorganChase have just put out a call for ideas. They're genuinely looking for as we think about the sort of set of solutions that are needed to truly fight this, they're really asking to hear from all of you about what are the innovative things happening at your organizations and in your communities, so check that out. So in summary, there's a growing threat. It is a problem, but there are a lot of leaders coming together to truly, fight this terrible crime. We're all going to get to know some new friends in law enforcement and cybersecurity and national security in order to get there. Join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.